Thank you very much, Ms. Sophia. Actually, the actual introduction, the official introduction will be done by Dr. Suhaib. But before we do that, I just want to have, I want to say that I'm really honored and I'm truly grateful that Professor Altarriba is with us today. And I want to share just my own personal part of knowing Dr. Altarriba before Dr. Suhaib does the official part. Dr. Altarriba is actually, for me, the most generous, kind, and supportive professor I've met in my life. And this is not an exaggeration. This is not a compliment. This is what she really deserves. I remember very much when I was a visiting scholar and I visited the USA. And at that time, I had limited time and I met professors. Professor Altarriba was the only one who did not have to stick certain hours to meet me. She was the only one who bought me dinner, if you remember Professor Altarriba. She was the only one who offered to take me to the restaurant and back home because I did not know what to do actually at that time. She was the one who really supported me with a lot of care and a lot of kindness. It's the warmth and the kindness I feel that students feel and people feel from scholars who are true supportive of their of students. Years it passed and I went through different things and I could not really do research for some time. And then when I wanted to go back on track, I just read some of her papers and I had one idea. And I wrote to her very shyly because I had not contacted her for years. And it was just a humble idea, but I shared with her and I was really, I did not think really she would, you know, take the risk of working with somebody who hasn't done research for so long, but being the figure, the prominent figure she is. And to my surprise, I mean, she was right away sending an email saying, yes, I will work with you. And she supported me. And now we have 3 or 4 papers actually published together, and we have a couple of papers under review. And I can never, ever really express my gratitude for her support. It's always how people make you feel and how people make you she always made me feel that I could go ahead and move forward and accomplish more. And I think it's these feelings that really great scholars with a true kind heart who know what research is all about and what scholarship is all about do that. So thank you so much, Professor Altarriba, for always honoring me and for being here. And I'll pass on the mic to Dr. Suhaib Sombol to do the official introduction.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dina, for a very touching introduction. I can see that Altarriba now is having tears in her eyes. It's really a pleasure, Professor Altarriba, to have you with us here today, a very big name in bilingualism and cognitive psychology. We are really honored to have you here with us today. Professor Jeanette Altarriba is professor in the Department of Psychology and interim dean, College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Albany, State University of New York. Her BA is from Florida International University and her MA and PhD from Vanderbilt University in Cognitive Psychology. Altarriba is the editor or co-editor of 7 books, including Cognition and Culture, Foundations of Bilingual Memory, Methods in Bilingual Reading Comprehension, and An Introduction to Bilingualism, Principles and Processes, which is now in the 2nd edition. Wow. She has published over 80 peer-reviewed research articles and is a sought-after speaker and presenter on a variety of topics, including memory, language, attention, emotion, and bilingualism. Thank you so much for being here with us. Before you start, I would just like to remind everyone, if you have any questions, please don't forget to write them in the QA box so that I can read them at the end. And if you have any comments, if you want to share your thoughts, you can use our Twitter hashtag PSUALR2020. Thank you so much. The floor is yours, Professor.
Thank you very much. Hopefully everyone can hear me clearly. Yes. I'm going to share my screen with you. All right. Can everyone view my screen?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Yes, my eyes are still watering. I'm sorry. Thank you for that introduction. It truly is touching. I don't even know what to say, except that Dr. Dina Dacus, for me, is an inspiration because of her motivation and her drive and all that she does for her research. She does not know that she is a role model for me as well. And so I'm very honored to be with all of you. If the situation would have permitted, I certainly would have been with you in person. So thank you for hosting me today. So my title indicates that we're talking about fundamentals and new approaches in learning language. I'm a cognitive psychologist by training. And so some of the things that I want to tell you about today have to do with the ways in which we examine language learning from basic research perspectives. So I'll tell you a little bit about tasks and measurements, and hopefully what you will gain from here are some fundamental issues that are important to consider when you design a program of language learning. So to get us started, I wanted to introduce you to some of our students from the University at Albany, and they're joining us today. They're going to be with us here today in our presentation. And these students from New York are here in this photo engaging in immersion and an education abroad program in the country of Costa Rica. So they'll be popping in and out, but the idea is that indeed, as I'm sure now you've heard from other presentations, motivation and the motivation to learn a new language, to learn new cultures is very important in language learning. So these students were motivated to travel and to be immersed in a culture for that purpose. So at issue for us is the knowledge of trying to understand what are the best practices or the tools that we have for learning a new language. Clearly, this is a monumental question. It's a question that has a very long history. And the idea is that we are interested in learning new languages to be able to understand other people, to communicate, to be able to grasp concepts that might be represented only in one language and may not necessarily translate to other languages. And to be able to do so much more that is culturally, socially, politically important for all of us. But the questions always still remain, what are those best practices or techniques or tools just for learning a language effectively? And from the cognitive perspective, what tasks or measures will help us capture the automatic access of that newly learned information? From a cognitive perspective, we're very interested in the brain and how automatically we learn information and code that information for future use. Now, we're not going to focus necessarily on the brain, but the notion of information processing, cognitive processes, the representation of language, memory, and learning is all a function of how the brain operates. So fundamentally, we are talking about the brain. So when we try to learn information, we try to learn the words for things. In this case, we have in English leaf. In Spanish, I might say hoja. And there may be many other languages in which there's a word or more than one word for this object. It's a concrete object as well. So that may play a role for us in thinking about how we learn the word that represents this object. So all of our words are symbols for particular objects, those that are more concrete. But we're also going to be concerned about words in this presentation that are abstract and words that are emotional. Another object, and for this object in English, I might call this a gift. I might call it a present. So those words may be ambiguous themselves. And in Spanish, I might call it un regalo. So there are a variety of different symbols that we might attach to this object. Now, what's important to understand is that for concrete objects like these, we may have a verbal label or a word that represents the object, but also they're represented as images. And to make the connection between the word and the image actually turns out to be a very powerful force in learning a new language. So we know that people have said a picture is worth 1,000 words. In fact, we may remember 1,000 pictures much more easily than 1,000 words. And so the idea is that this is one of the fundamentals, as we will find out, and that is the notion of things being picturable or using imagery in order to help learn a new language. So the reality of why it is that it might be that concrete objects might be remembered better, and we have a little bit of theory here of dual coding theory from Pavio's work, Alan Pavio's work. It's not necessary to really understand all the aspects of the model here, but mostly to understand that when we intake information from the environment, and potentially there's a verbal representation of that information, which is the word, but also nonverbal in terms of the picture that we have. All of that information is stored. And when we want to retrieve a particular word, we can either think of the word, we can remember the word by activating that system, but we may also understand that word by activating the picture. We may remember the picture and then be able to activate the word that represents that picture. The relationship is bidirectional between these two areas that represent information. So what's important to understand is when we talk about learning a new language, I know that very often the idea is learning words and phrases, but from a cognitive perspective, it's much richer than that. The question becomes, what are the features of those words that contribute to learning the language? And words not only carry meaning, they carry form, and they may be represented by pictures in a variety of ways. So when we look at those levels of representation, those are the ones that can better inform how it is that we learn a new language. Now, we're not going to go too far back too often here in terms of what we know, but when we look at some earlier research on language learning, and the research occurred with young children as well as adults. In this particular demonstration, fourth grade boys and girls who were native English speakers acquired words in an Indonesian language. The way that that was accomplished was through associating the word in English with its translation in the new language by way of also a black and white picture that represented the word in the new language with that word. And so they were tested in these ways. So first of all, they acquired this new language, those words, either again by being paired with a picture or being paired with a word. And at this point in this kind of research, these pairings were presented on cards, one every 8 seconds. When then individuals were asked to recall those words that they had learned in the new language, the words were learned much better, that is, recall was higher in the picture word condition than in the word-word group. So in this particular demonstration, having presented words attached to pictures actually improved memory for these fourth grade boys and girls. So one method of trying to learn words is to pair them with a new word in a new language. So this for us is a notion of paired associate learning in cognition, and pairing those words that are translations or pairing a picture with a word creates a connection between those two objects. So again, remember, if those words also are very concrete, they might remember it via the picture or the word. So this is why the picture conditions tend to do better in many cases, because individuals have different ways of remembering the word versus simply just a word attached to another word. In our research, we expanded this particular work to try to examine the acquisition of words in Spanish. So here what you see in one possible condition of learning this new language, the word reloj is the translation in Spanish for the word clock. And edificio is the translation of building, and luna is the translation for moon. In learning these new words in Spanish, you might have them paired with other words in English that you know. You might have them paired with a picture that represents that object, the picture, and the new word in the new language. Or maybe that picture is in color, and so you have a color image that's paired with that word. So what we attempted to do was teach the language based on these types of pairings, teach these vocabulary words in Spanish to our participants who were native English-speaking monolinguals, right? So they had no knowledge of the Spanish language, and we were attempting to work on a format for them to learn these new words in Spanish. And these were the three formats: the word condition, the black and white image and word condition, or the color image and the word. So this is our basic research and an attempt to expand on and extend the earlier research in this area. Now, for the learning, the idea is to present these pairings to individuals, to these participants, repeat these pairings, and then our learning phases always have a type of test. So you want to know whether or not individuals are learning these words and to what extent they're learning them. And before you test them on that knowledge, you want to be sure that they have actually acquired the information. So in this case, these words are in Spanish, and individuals receive the English words and they need to match them to the correct Spanish word. This is not an atypical type of test in learning language. The other that involves the semantic level of representation or thinking of the meaning of the word includes these sentences and the Spanish words, and participants need to write in the correct Spanish word. And then the definition is another type of test that measures semantics. So, as I've mentioned previously, in our type of research, we want to think about the word in the sense of the way it looks orthographically, the way that it sounds, and also its meaning. And to the extent that we're testing that meaning and having individuals understand that meaning, this tends to lead to better learning. So we teach this information to our participants. We test them this way to know they have the information. And then we put them into another testing situation. And in this case, in the particular testing situation, these participants were shown the correct translations in terms of using words, or a mismatch or incorrect translations. And they had to respond very quickly as to whether or not the pairs of items were true translations. So to return to our conditions, I will tell you then that the results indicated to us that in order for the responses for these particular words that were actual true translations, these translations actually were responded to quicker or faster than having been learned in any other situation. So in order for participants to respond whether or not the information they received at test were correct translations, they actually performed that task of being able to identify that correctly much faster in the word condition. However, what is very interesting is if we tested memory for the meaning or the actual understanding of these words, and we looked at their ability to distinguish these true translations from false translations, the black and white image condition actually led to the best memory for the meanings of these words. So learning the information in this way, by way of a very simple picture and the word, actually led to the best memory or meaning and understanding for these items. And actually the color image condition did not do as well. So this is quite interesting. One of the reasons, of course, is there is more information to process once you have the color, and this is at the level of features. So we can talk about words, we can talk about their representations in terms of, again, sounds and concepts, semantics or meaning, but also the number of features. As it turns out, the condition that had this type of learning did not do as well as the other types of learning. But there's also a very important fundamental of our fundamentals to learn here. And that is that when we tested our participants, we tested them only to identify pairs of words as correct or incorrect translations. So this condition, the word condition, most closely matched between learning and test. In cognitive psychology, we would say that transfer appropriate processing was involved in the learning. And so individuals were able to quickly map from having learned words as words to the word type test. And that's all well and good, but of course, what we would like to have them do is expand that knowledge and transfer that knowledge to many other conditions. So it's very interesting to consider that in some ways, the way that individuals encode or learn information is closely related to their performance when they try to retrieve or recall that information, right? But this takeaway as to the benefit of using these types of images that are very simple pictures, easy to process, and that they are paired with this word, we're going to come back to in our research. So we then, in the laboratory, considered, well, it's very interesting to study items that are concrete, like our tiger here that has a picture representation, as well as the word tiger. But what happens when a word is abstract? Another fundamental to consider in language learning is not all words are the same kind. Not all words are of the same type or same category. And our laboratory set about trying to distinguish words that were non-emotional and particularly concrete and abstract from words that represented an emotion. So here's our friend here ready to give a keynote address. Although this facial image is one that might represent this word, it is still clearly the case that concrete objects, objects that are tangible, that exist, are more easily linked to their image than both abstract and emotion words. So now we have a very interesting situation here to consider. Might there be different best practices and different techniques for acquiring words depending on the type of word that we're talking about? At about the time that we were thinking about the processing of emotion words, we were also looking very closely at emotional intelligence and the work of Daniel Goleman. And so that work inspired us to consider cognitively what research exists in terms of understanding emotion, which is another major area that we look at in terms of acquisition and in terms of the research in my laboratory. So we set about trying to understand a little more about emotion. Well, we know that emoticons, the representations of emotions, this is quite popular in texting, quite popular in emails, that the notion that even a very simple symbol here or set of symbols can represent emotions. So we found this of interest because information processing now and the way that symbolically we represented those types of emotions could be represented now in a variety of new ways that we might not have been accustomed to in the past. Now, our friends are going to join us again. Here's our students. And this is a great picture demonstrating their emotion on their study abroad, their education abroad, and their backdrop is the famous volcano Arenal in Costa Rica. But there are ways in which we can measure emotion that really do indicate to us that as a word group, they're very different than concrete words or abstract words when we're trying to learn a new language. Here we're introduced to a type of methodology that examines words in terms of the eye movements for those words in reading. So basically what these individuals are looking at our screen and this is calibrating their view of that screen. And the idea is that we would present information, it could be words, it could be images, and try to understand the ways in which the eyes move in relation to that information. And in fact, we were able to do some of this research and we were able to present words and information that was positive, negative, or neutral. And as we examined where the eye lands on these particular types of words, how long in terms of milliseconds the eye actually stays on these words, whether or not the vision then returns to these words and moves in and out of these words with such precision. It's also the case that we were able to determine that as individuals read words that represent concrete, abstract, or emotion type words, behavior is very different. And just by our understanding that words that are positive and negative, that are emotional, are actually going to be processed in some cases much more quickly than neutral information, tells us that the ways in which we learn words that are represented by emotional and non-emotional concepts may differ. And so we may want to understand word acquisition, not simply in general, but based on the types of words. Now, we are most interested also in how the brain is automatically processing that information. And for that, we might use a particular type of tool that helps us understand how we can process information in a very automatic way. So let me show you a particular task. I'm going to show you a word, and the idea is that you should name the color that the word is presented in. So if you're ready, here's the word. So the correct answer here would be red. I'm going to show you another word. And again, very quickly, you should name the color of that word, the color that it is in. Now, the correct answer here is green, but many of you might have said red instead. We call this the color word Stroop task, and this was first documented by Stroop in 1935. So this is a task that we still use so commonly today for what it demonstrates in terms of our ability to think about interference as a paradigm that would measure for us how much knowledge we have of the information that we're looking at. In this case, red in red ink is a congruent condition. Red in green ink is an incongruent condition. The interference we measure stems from the activation of what the word represents and how that interferes with our ability to name its color. So if you are familiar with this language, you're familiar with the word red, R-E-D. You've read this with a lot of frequency. And so what you automatically tend to do is read the word. But in this case, the task was to name its color. Now, if you're not familiar with this word, or it doesn't have great meaning for you, then you're able to do this very quickly. But when the response, in a sense, is incongruent with behaviorally what you're automatically doing, which is reading the word, then you get a measure. And in fact, that measure might be longer than the congruent condition and give us some indication about how deeply you understand that particular word. So in our laboratory, what we decided to do was to consider that this interference could be a measure of how well you know a language. Because if you're not very familiar with a language and I present it to you in a certain color, it might be very easy for you to name its color. You're just looking at one of the features of the word, but the semantics don't really have an impact on you. But if the more you know a language, the more difficult it is to be able to decipher this type of interference, or that is name the color when it's not congruent with what you're automatically doing, which is reading the word. So this could be a great diagnostic. Moreover, this particular task has been expanded to emotional situations. So if you see a word that represents an emotion, you might be asked to name its color as quickly as possible. And here we see a few words and they appear in color. Now, with emotion words, it's quite interesting that those reaction times are longer, tend to be longer than for words that are not emotional. If we were to actually do this task, we might show you at the center of a computer screen a particular word, and these are the different conditions that we would have. The word blue would appear on the screen. This is the traditional color word Stroop task. Maybe this word green, or maybe this word. And again, your job is to say the color of the ink. So the correct answers here are blue, green, and blue, though this particular word might cause some delay in response. There are these words that are not related to color. They're neutral in the sense that they're not related to color, and they could be quite easy for you to name in terms of the color of those words. But then there are a set of negative words here for which you're asked to name the color. And in fact, what we find in the general research in most cases, individuals do take longer to name the color of these types of words, particularly the negative words, than for neutral words, certainly, and very often than for color words. So knowing the semantics of this word in terms of emotion and how negatively it's related to that emotion poses a kind of interference that makes it more difficult to name the color of this word. And again, what you might do is present a particular fixation point in the center of the screen. That's a fixation is replaced by a word, and individuals have to either press a key or name the color. Then there's another fixation and then another word. So this is how you would do these types of studies. These are the separate trials that you have. And it's very careful in terms of setting up presentation time because you're looking at automatic processing. Now, let's say that we were interested in learning a new language and that those words that we're interested in learning in might involve emotion words, abstract words, and concrete words. So we're looking at the different word types, again, with the notion that when we're trying to teach a new language, we want to learn a new language, all words may not be treated equally. They may be very different and have different features that we need to consider when we're trying to learn the language. So what we have here is the word, this one is in Spanish, this is in English, 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 and Spanish. So there are different pairs, and again, we can switch the order of the pairs, but each one of these pairings is a pair of a word in English and a word in Spanish. In the learning phase of these, we would typically have individuals learn the words in particular sets of words, and those sets would contain words from each of the different word types that we might mix together, because in fact, when you're teaching a new language, you might be mixing these types of words together. And we go through the sets of words in several times so that we make sure that individuals are learning these words. And the way we might do that is we might present on a computer screen, again, a fixation point. Then we present the word, in this case in Spanish, and then we have the Spanish word in the English translation. And typically in our studies, the participants are also hearing these words spoken by someone who is bilingual and fluent in these two languages. So by this measure, we're having individuals learn these words. The learning that takes place in our laboratory typically involves various modes, the way the words look, the way they sound, and then we are testing individuals again in terms of meaning. So we may ask them to fill in the correct English word next to its Spanish translation. We would provide the English words in random order, likewise the Spanish words, and again, they're matching. And this matching, of course, can be done lexically, considering just what set of letters pertains to another set. But of course, we don't want to stop there. We have semantics involved, the typical sentences. They're given the words, they need to fill those words in as well. And it's also the case we may have another matching type task. And here we're having individuals write the Spanish words. So again, we typically will present this to students who are English speakers who have no knowledge of the Spanish language. This is a test then to make sure still part of learning, the test that's part of learning, because we want to make sure that they do capture this information. And this is also a final test in learning. And again, it's important that they are writing the new word in the new language. When we are using our learning techniques in order to learn a new language, we're always having them learn or encode that language and then testing them. And we don't move to the actual test or the actual experiment unless we're confident that they really know the language. So we get them through these tests, right? But now we want to use our task that tells us a little bit about how individuals, how deeply they learn information. And this again is our emotional Stroop task. So in this case, then we would present this fixation point, and this basically has individuals focus on the center of a computer screen. And this point then is replaced by what is the Spanish word. And again, the individual will need to respond to that word and press one of 4 keys. We had 4 different colors. So this was all presented at random. The English words do not appear here. This is now the new language or the test of the new language. And what we like to see is how quickly and accurately our participants can actually press a key to indicate which color this word appears in. Remember again, the more interference, the likely it is, the more they actually process the meaning of that word, right? So this is an emotional Stroop task in a new language. What we do then is measure their reaction time, and that tells us something about the automaticity of being able to actually name that color and the amount of interference you might have with the meaning of that word. We find that for emotion words in a new language, on average, we measure these reactions in terms of milliseconds. 1,000 milliseconds would be equivalent to 1 second. They're fastest for emotion words. And we did not find differences between abstract and concrete words, though you can tell they take a little longer to understand. So this gradient, the fact that these responses are very different across these word types, is another indication that the same practice of learning a language or learning vocabulary may not apply to every different type of word. In this case, they were actually faster, which is quite interesting. Although it is the case that these are emotion words, when you find that individuals are in their dominant language and they're more knowledgeable about that language, the emotion condition actually tends to produce a very slow reaction time. What this also indicates to us, and in conjunction with other research that we have conducted in our laboratory, is that in order for individuals to actually understand what an emotional word means and have the same impact, they need to experience that emotion in many different contexts. So this is very different than abstract and concrete words. You can match a concrete word to another concrete word and have an object, and basically it ends there. But the acquisition of emotion is very particular. The acquisition of emotion very often, depending on its intensity, depending on the amount of arousal that it causes, and depending on whether it's positive or negative, although in our demonstrations we used all negative words, this will determine this reaction time. And in fact, these reaction times are very different from the very basic emotion color word. So there is learning that's taking place through our method, but actually it will lead to very different outcomes depending on the word type. All right. So in addition to fundamentals, our presentation today promised to you some new or novel research in learning a second language. So some of you might be familiar with this notion that I've borrowed here, right, for our laboratory. And what I'd like to do is tell you about some newer research in memory that has great applications to learning a new language. So we have to talk about memory because that's where this information is stored. In order for us to be able to actually recall information, report information, respond to many of these tasks, of course, it's a given that these words are represented in memory. So in terms of cognition and information processing, we speak about the way words are represented in memory. But there's also something very important to understand, which is why do we use memory? What is the purpose of memory? And how do we enhance memory? Because if the notion is to learn a new language, to be able to use that new language in a variety of contexts, to be able to recall words in that new language and use that successfully, memory is important. So if memory is important, it's very interesting for us to try to understand, well, how might we improve memory? And that might be a key to trying to learn a new language. Okay, so let's return a little bit to our students who are in Costa Rica and they're immersed in their environment. Well, when you're in an environment, a new environment, you may be needing to think about food, a food source. Now, rest assured, our students were very well fed. This was not something that they needed to do to survive. Well, you also might need to think of sources of water, right? And so these are some basic things that we need to think of when we're in new environments. You also might be needing to think about your own safety, right? And safety from predators. Well, this may not be a true predator per se, but there are many other predators in Costa Rica, right? So when we think about these particular ways of being and the notion that survival is important, how might that relate to memory? And in fact, how might that help us in ways to learn a new language? So again, the use of memory. Now, memory probably didn't involve simply to remember facts in the past, but to try to put that information together and probably in some ways to tune our memories to very particular kinds of information. In fact, where was the food source? Where is the water source? How do we stay safe and healthy? How do we protect ourselves in a variety of ways? This is in a sense the use of memory and why memory would evolve. It's also the case that they may be evolved in order to maintain our survival in terms of solutions and so on. So this is a very basic way of thinking about memory. But the question is, if you had to think about these aspects of memory, could it have any impact on learning a new language and acquiring a language? So we wanted to put this to the test. So let's suppose that you are presented with this particular passage. Okay, this is a paragraph, it's a passage. In this task, we would like you to imagine that you are stranded in the grasslands of a foreign land without any basic survival materials. Over the next few months, you'll need to find steady supplies of food and water and protect yourself from predators. We're going to show you a list of words, and we would like you to rate how relevant each of these words would be for you in this survival situation. Some of the words may be relevant and others may not. It's up to you to decide. Now, supposing that this passage were presented to a participant, right? And they read this passage, and indeed, they are given a list of words that they need to rate. But then, unexpectedly, we ask them to recall those words. And this could be a very basic list of words for objects and particular items, and some of them may seem relevant or not, very simple words. But we're testing their memory. In the original work, where this was presented first, these are the different conditions. You might read the passage that I showed you and read to you. You might only rate the words for how pleasant they are without seeing the passage. You might consider imaging or thinking about images. You might relate the words to yourself. You might be asked to generate additional information from each of those words. Or I might say to you, simply study this list of words because you will receive a test of these words. And then again, all these conditions, this was the most intentional one, but these are very incidental ways of learning, and these individuals receive a test. What has been found that's very interesting in this type of encoding or memory technique is that proportion correct, that's the correct recall of those words that individuals were asked to rate, and in this case, to study as well. The memory is much greater for the survival condition. So this has been a very provocative newer effect in memory research. Of all of these different learning situations or learning conditions, the survival condition actually produced better memory. So there must be something about the attentional aspects, the image aspects, the arousal aspects, maybe the emotional aspects of thinking about one's survival that improves memory. Could this mechanism then improve learning of a new language? So what we decided to do was to test this notion of thinking in a particular mode, being immersed in that mode, and whether or not it could improve learning of a second language, learning of a new language. Our participants were English monolinguals or bilinguals, but what is important about the entire group of participants is that they had no knowledge of the Spanish language, the language we wanted to teach them. So in the intentional case, this is what participants would read. In this task, we are going to teach you a list of Spanish-English translations. We would like you to try to remember the new Spanish words for a future memory test. Thank you. We had another condition that says today, it's the same survival, but it says today you encountered a stranger. You must work together to guarantee your chances of survival. The stranger speaks Spanish, but you do not. So you will have to learn some words in their new language. So this is a motivational aspect, which is very important to language learning. The motivation is in the context of survival. Another control comparison. Today, you will be getting a new roommate who only speaks Spanish. You must learn some words in their language to improve your living situation and study abroad experience, right? So these are the different conditions. Again, you will be rating words, and then we would unexpectedly test your memory. You heard these words and their translations, and we actually presented the pictures of these items as well. But remember, the first phase of this learning involved being in that survival mode or having that passage moving or just intentional instructions. You listened and you saw to pictures and you looked at these pairs. We actually tested you then in your memory in 3 different tasks. You would complete sentences, you would have to provide those items, or you would have to name these pictures, or we would give you the Spanish and English words and you have to match them together. This might seem like there's a lot of data, but I'm going to make it very, very simple for you. Whenever we look at the type of task that we tested, and some of our items were animate or inanimate, but that's not so much our focus. The only thing you need to focus on is that the condition of individuals recalling those particular words or our memory test for those words was always greater when they were in the survival condition. And it didn't matter what task we had or how we tested subjects or whether or not the type of item that they had, being in this survival mode actually did improve memory for these words. Now, I know that many of you are working on how to teach these new languages. So in a sense, we leave this basic research to you to consider how can you put a condition like this or something in the spirit of this condition to improve memory. Because the type of improvement that we saw in learning a new language was quite vast. So we're coming to an end, but let me tell you about some of the latest research that we have right now that is in progress, and that is to understand how sounds are important in language learning. We've talked a lot about meaning. I've shown you pictures and how we can acquire information that has different features. We've talked about different word types. It may not be the same to learn an emotion word or to learn a concrete word, but what about the role of sound? And in particular, accents and how we process information that is accented. Now, it turns out when you hear someone with what we might call an accent, there are cases where different types of tasks and learning, judgments about sentences or identification of words, the familiar accent might cause better processing or improved performance as compared to unfamiliar accents. But there are moments where familiar accents actually are not as good as the unfamiliar. Recognition of words, maybe trying to remember where you heard that word, because the accent actually might provide some additional information that is unique or novel, or actually captures attention. And that attentional capture sometimes helps you actually remember the information because it was in an unfamiliar accent. And what we are doing now currently is trying to understand better the role of sound and accent, pronunciation, and phonology in learning a second language. So what role does phonology play? And what we've done recently is in the language of Marathi, there are some words that we wanted individuals who had no knowledge of this language to acquire. And we presented them using our various techniques in the language with that accent, or with an American English accent, or in fact, an Irish accent, right? So the accents varied in the learning of this new language. So they heard these words in the different accents, and they were supposed to actually try to recall the English translations of these words. What we found, and this is just accuracy, this is a measure of their performance. Our participants learning a new language actually did better in these measures of their learning of these languages when the accents that were unfamiliar were used. Their performance was better than when the accent was the American English accent, right? indicating to us that in this particular format and in our type of teaching of these languages and what we did in our study, the unfamiliarity of the accent actually helped memory. These are very interesting studies to have because of the notion that particularly here in the United States, we may have international instructors for our courses that are actually their information as they pronounce that information is accented. So those accents in this particular demonstration may actually improve the ability to process the information and later remember or recall that information. This is work for us that is in its infancy. So the next time you invite me to present, I'll be able to tell you more about the role of phonology and what that role plays in terms of acquisition. Well, we're at the end of our time together. Hopefully you learned a few of the fundamentals. You saw something novel. Our students wanted to collect and say goodbye to you. So they wish you well in all your research endeavors and all your teaching endeavors. And I think they really did enjoy their time abroad, immersed in a new culture and in a new language. And for that, they tell you in their new language, thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting, very informative. We have learned a lot about methods in cognitive psychology. You know, this area of cognitive psychology and psycholinguistics is still new here in Saudi. So I'm really glad that you gave us this very interesting, informative introduction. Eye tracking, the Stroop task. Thank you so much. It was amazing. And the pictures of your students as well. Very interesting ones. Okay, so I think we still have like 10 minutes for questions before we move to the workshops. So if you allow me, I would read them just out loud for you. So here we have a question from Sadie. She's saying, my daughter is 8 years old. She has big problems regarding memorizing words for dictation. She can't memorize the spelling at all. She can only write through using sounds, but doesn't remember uncommon pronunciation of letters. She's always depressed due to her low marks. How can I help her?
I mean, some of the aspects of learning a language, first of all, there are a lot of individual differences in learning a language. So although that's not meant to not give hope, sometimes it's going to take a lot more practice and a lot more familiarity to be able to learn the information. I think that from a memory perspective, the idea is great practice and frequency, and actually making sure that you do a lot of learning that pairs the correct, you know, the presentation orthographically with sounds or clues to what those sounds are, whether it might be in a phonetic type of way or way, and sort of learning and matching. The idea would be that over learning and matching and hearing the pronunciation over and over and over again. So it's going to take a lot more episodes of trying to learn and to connect all the information together. So I would say don't lose hope. It actually is a feature that is amenable to practice and to frequency. And again, what we've learned here is that multiple ways of learning the orthography and the phonology, it might be through pictures, it might be through sound, it might be through also recording herself. I don't know if that's actually something that has been tried, but the recording or the sound, the modality of listening to your own voice and trying to understand how to pronounce information or how the connection between the sound, recording your own voice and reporting and replaying that actually also increases the frequency of being able to make that distinction. So there are a few techniques that can still be used, but you need to have a lot of patience and you need to continue. It's a matter of frequency of occurrence.
Thank you very much. We have another question here from Faisal. I think he's talking about per dissociate learning, the slide in which you talked about colored pictures versus black and white pictures. So he's asking, would mixing word condition and image condition, which means black and white or color, is that going to enhance learner performance?
Yes, it may. And, you know, I think what's interesting with all of this is that obviously when we're in the world, we're traversing the world, we are actually, of course, not seeing black and white pictures. Most of the time you're seeing colored pictures. I think it's a gradient. I think it's the idea that we're learning through words and we have words, that's very well. And then we are hoping that that information then transfers to pictures, and then it transfers to very complex pictures, but that's over time. I think that that could be a great technique to use, is to mix them together as well. But again, every time you add a feature, and color is considered a feature, and then color itself has multiple features, shading, whether there's dark, whether there's light, you know, there are multiple features of color. That adds more information. Every time you add more information in terms of information processing, the load is greater. So it takes longer to be able to enhance that information, memorize that information. So what we're seeing is we're going from letters all the way up to colored pictures. And that continuum that you have means we're increasing features, we're increasing information. And that's why you see that it might take longer, or in just these laboratory experiments, it might take longer to actually be able to identify things, learn through a picture. There's much more of a load. All of this really takes a lot of practice and frequency. And paired associate learning is something that over time is the time invested. And that's why in our routines of learning, there's so many ways of trying to emphasize the meaning, the sound, the visual representation, the context with sentences. It's all very important in terms of really getting to the depth of the information.
Thank you. I think we still have time for one more question. So Iman here is asking, after thanking you, of course, for a very enlightening talk, she's asking, what is your recommendation to teachers whose syllabus requires they teach long bi-weekly word lists, averaging like 50 words, derived from assigned weekly passages? And of course, here she's talking about the limited teacher-student time. So you, instead of paying attention to interaction in the classroom, you're actually giving them lists to memorize. She's contrasting those two ideas. Is it more important to interact with the students in the class, or is it more important to give them more lists to remember?
That's a really, and that really begs the question of what these interactions would be like. You know, I guess my initial impression is to say some of both is very important. The act of learning these words also is enhanced by the student trying to make the connection the way they see that. For some students, it is sounds. For other students, they're looking orthographically at some relationship, and they're trying to piece it together. In a sense, it's a keyword method, right? So they're looking at it and say, how am I going to unite these things? And sometimes the individual student will be able to connect the information to something personal. That connection is a connection that student will remember. So there's a combination of both. Actually, the engagement and the interaction is good because they're hearing someone else pronounce it. Maybe you're showing pictures or videos, something interactive. But the learning does have, in a sense, an individual component where that person needs to look at the connection that they can make based on themselves. And because there's so many individual differences, for some students it's trying to connect what they look like. Oh, it reminds me of this object, or whenever I see this feature, it means this word, this is the word, or the way this word ends, that reminds me of its meaning. And so people have personal experiences. It's the personal experiences and those connections, and they're going to be different for the different students, that really will enhance memory versus somebody trying to give you a connection that you might not relate to or understand. So elements of both might be a good enriching environment for learning.
Thank you so much. Actually, this reminds me of what Norbert Schmidt said in the beginning of the day, mixing explicit and implicit learning. It's not only about teaching in the classroom, but also you need to expose your students to more language. Correct. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We are so much pleased to have you here today. Very much honored. Very interesting presentation. Everybody here, by the way, is thanking you in the chat area. We have been really honored to have you here with us today. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure and an honor. Thank you. And I wish everyone good wishes for your research and continued success. It is an exciting field, applied linguistics. And I look forward to seeing the rest of the presentations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, so with that, we come to the end of this very interesting session. Now we can go to our other rooms for the workshops. Thank you so much.